The hand connected with the back of her head, not a slap, but a hard proprietary shove. It sent her stumbling forward, the heel of her silver shoe catching on the plush carpet of the sky lounge. For a sickening moment, the entire city, a glittering tapestry of light and shadow laid out 1,000 feet below, seemed to tilt on its axis. She did not scream. She did not cry out. Elara Hayes had learned long ago that silence was a shield, and sometimes a weapon. The shove was not meant to injure, not in a way that would leave a visible mark. It was meant to correct, to remind her of her place. "Stand up straight," Marcus hissed, his voice a low, venomous thread in her ear, masked from the glittering partygoers by the smooth jazz of a live trio. "You look like a wilting flower. People are watching." People were always watching. That was the point of nights like this. The Obsidian Gala, held on the penthouse floor of the brand-new Ethelred Tower, was the culmination of 4 years of her life. 4 years of sleepless nights, of meticulous calculations, of wrestling with impossible physics and stubborn city ordinances. 4 years of pouring her soul into the steel and glass skeleton that now pierced the clouds. Her triumph, and her name, was nowhere. She straightened, the emerald silk of her gown whispering against her skin. It was a beautiful dress, architecturally, precise in its cut, a column of deep, living green. Marcus had chosen it. He chose everything. He believed it made her an extension of his own impeccable taste. He did not understand that she wore it like armor, another layer of anonymity. "That's better," he murmured, his hand now resting on the small of her back, a gesture that looked like affection to the casual observer. To her, it felt like a brand. "Now, when Senator Rawlings comes over, you smile. You tell him how brilliant I am. You remember the script. There was always a script." He had not updated the file. He was working from a version of her that had never been accurate, a projection of his own needs. A beautiful, silent, agreeable partner who validated his genius. He had no idea that the woman standing beside him had been meticulously planning her exit for 6 months, packing her life into a single hidden storage unit, one piece of her stolen identity at a time. Tonight was supposed to be the end. His grandest victory lap, and her quiet, final departure. She had waited for him to be absorbed by a fawning circle of investors, his back to her as he accepted their adulation, the architect of the skyline. She had seen her chance, a clear path to the private elevator, and she had taken it. She had made it 10 feet before his hand clamped around her arm, his fingers digging into the bone. "And where do you think you're going?" The confrontation had been a blur of his controlled fury. His face, so handsome on magazine covers, had contorted into something tight and ugly. He had dragged her from the main floor into this smaller, more secluded lounge overlooking the northern sprawl of the city. He thought it was more private. He was wrong. He released her arm, turning to face the window, his posture meant to convey relaxed authority. It was a performance. Everything with Marcus was a performance. "You have an obligation, Elara. An obligation to me, to this project. You don't just walk away when I am closing the biggest deal of my life." Her voice, when she finally used it, was low and steady. It held the kind of quiet that doesn't echo. The kind that settles. "The project is finished, Marcus. My obligation is fulfilled." He laughed, a short, sharp, ugly sound. "Your obligation? You drew some pictures. I made it real. I willed this building into existence. Why? You are a glorified draftsman. Without me, you'd be designing suburban tract homes." Each word was a familiar stone worn smooth from overuse. He had been throwing them at her for years, slowly eroding her confidence until she almost believed him. Almost. But she had the blueprints, not the glossy, simplified versions presented to the press, but the real ones, the ones with her name, her credentials, her soul scrawled in the title block. They were safe. Everything was safe. She just had to walk away. "I'm leaving," she said. It was not a plea. It was a statement of fact. His face darkened. The mask of the charming developer fell away completely, revealing the tyrant beneath. "You're not going anywhere. You are mine. This building is mine." Everything you are is because of me." He stepped toward her, his hand raising, and for the first time in their years together, she flinched. She saw the blow coming. She closed her eyes, bracing for the impact, for the sharp, humiliating pain. But it never landed. There was a sound, not a loud sound. The soft, crystalline clink of a glass being set down on a marble tabletop. It cut through the tension in the room, like a razor. "That's far enough, Marcus." The voice was quiet, deeper than the cello in the other room. It was not a command filled with anger or threat. It was a simple declaration of a boundary that had already been crossed. It held the weight of absolute, unhurried authority. Elara opened her eyes. Marcus had frozen, his hands still raised, his body rigid. His eyes were wide, fixed on a point behind her. The arrogance that was his lifeblood seemed to drain from him, replaced by a pale, sickly confusion, then a dawning horror. She turned slowly. In the corner of the lounge, seated in a low leather armchair, she hadn't even noticed, was occupied, was a man. He was dressed in a charcoal suit, so perfectly tailored it seemed less like clothing, and more like a part of him. His hair was dark, his face was a study, in sharp, elegant lines. He looked like he had been carved from stone in patience. His stillness was the most profound thing in the room. He did not rush. He was not performing. He was simply there, and his presence had bent the reality of the room around him. This was Julian Thorne. Elara knew the name, of course. Everyone knew the name. Thorne Industries was a silent behemoth, its holdings vast and varied. And Julian Thorne was the primary near-mythical investor behind the Aethelred Tower. He was a ghost in the machine, a name on the highest-level documents, but never a face at the press conferences. Marcus had spoken of him in hushed, reverent tones, a god of capital whose favor was to be courted at all costs. Julian Thorne's eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were not on Marcus. They were on her. He wasn't looking at her dress or her face. He was looking at her, at the very core of her, with an unnerving, quiet intensity. It was the first time all night she felt truly seen. "Mr. Thorne," Marcus stammered, his hand dropping to his side. He tried to rearrange his face back into a confident smile, but it was a twitching, unconvincing mess. "I didn't see you there. We were just having a private discussion." Julian Thorne's gaze finally shifted to Marcus. It was a slow, deliberate movement. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Your discussion is over. Your presence here is no longer required." He made a small, almost imperceptible gesture with his hand. From the shadows near the doorway, 2 men materialized. They were built like mountains and moved with the silent, fluid efficiency of predators. They wore the same dark suits as their employer, their faces impassive. They were not security guards. They were something else entirely. "Now wait a minute," Marcus began, his voice rising in panic. "You can't just—" "I can," Julian Thorne interrupted, his voice still impossibly calm. His voice steady as iron, wrapped in silk. "And I am. Remove him." The 2 men flanked Marcus. They did not grab him. They simply stood there, their presence an undeniable physical fact. Marcus looked from one to the other, then back to Julian Thorne, who was already looking at Elara again, as if Marcus had ceased to exist. Defeated, humiliated, Marcus turned and walked between the 2 men, his swagger gone, replaced by the shuffling gait of a man who had just lost control of his own story. The 3 of them disappeared through the door without another sound. The silence that descended was different now. It was not the tense, brittle silence of before. This was a deep, structural silence, the kind of silence that holds things up. Elara stood there, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was trembling, a fine, uncontrollable tremor running through her, the adrenaline of the confrontation, the shock of the intervention. It was all crashing down on her at once. Julian Thorne rose from his chair. He moved with the same unhurried grace he did everything else. He walked, not to her, but to the small bar in the corner of the room, and poured a glass of water from a crystal decanter. He walked back and held it out to her. His fingers did not touch hers as she took it. "Breathe," he said. It was not a suggestion. It was a quiet instruction for a biological process. he observed was not functioning correctly. She took a sip of the water. It was cold and clean. She took a deep, shuddering breath. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was thin, fragile. He gave a slight, formal nod. He stood a respectful distance away, his hands clasped behind his back. He was giving her space, a commodity she had not realized she was so starved for. "He will not bother you again," Julian Thorne stated, his gaze fixed on the city lights below. It was a promise delivered with the finality of a death sentence. Elara wrapped her arms around herself. The emerald silk felt cold now. "You don't know him." "He won't stop." "Yes, I do," he said, turning his head slightly to look at her. "I know he is leveraged to the hilt. I know his company's valuation is based almost entirely on the successful completion of this building. I know he has 3 other projects on the verge of collapse. And I know he has a pathological need for control, which he mistakes for strength." He paused. "I make it my business to know the people I entrust with $1 billion. She stared at him, stunned into silence. He had just laid out Marcus's entire psychological and financial profile in 5 calm sentences. He saw him. He saw him with the same terrifying clarity with which he was now seeing her. "What happens now?" she asked, the question hanging in the quiet air. He turned to face her fully. "Now I escort you out of this building. My car is waiting downstairs. You will need a place to stay where he cannot reach you. My estate is secure." A jolt of alarm went through her. She had just escaped one cage. She was not about to walk willingly into another, no matter how gilded. "Mr. Thorne, I appreciate your help more than you know. But I can take care of myself. I have arrangements. You have a storage unit in a commercial park in Queens and a reservation at a motel near the airport," he said, his voice devoid of judgment. It was a simple recitation of data. "That is not a plan. That is a flight path. It is insufficient." The blood drained from her face. How could he possibly know that had he been investigating her? The thought was terrifying. A new kind of violation. "Ah." As if reading her mind, he clarified. "When Marcus Vance put your name forward as a junior consultant on this project, I ran a standard background check, as I do on everyone. When the initial architectural drafts came in, they were exceptional, far beyond the capabilities of a junior consultant, or, for that matter, of Marcus Vance. So I commissioned a more thorough and more discreet inquiry." He looked at her directly, and the force of his recognition was like a physical blow. "I've reviewed every blueprint, every load-bearing calculation, every structural stress report. The real ones, the ones you kept on a private server, not the simplified versions he presented to the board." He took a step closer. "He never introduced you in meetings. You were always the silent woman in the back of the room, the one holding the portfolio, the one they never bothered to name." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "But your signature is on the foundational plans, Miss Hayes. The real ones." He had called her Miss Hayes, not Elara, a formal, respectful acknowledgement of her professional identity. An identity Marcus had tried so hard to erase. "He asked for your name," a new voice said. The voice was female, sharp, and carried a dry wit. A woman with a severe black bob and a tablet tucked under her arm had entered the room as silently as the security men. She looked from Julian to Elara, before anyone else's. "The day the first schematics arrived," he said, "find out who this is." Julian Thorne gave the woman a look that was not quite a glare, but close. "Thank you, Beatrice. That will be all." Beatrice smirked, a tiny, fleeting expression. "Of course, Mr. Thorne. The car is ready. I've taken the liberty of canceling the motel reservation, and I've dispatched a team to the Queen's facility. They will have her belongings delivered to the estate by morning." She glanced at Elara. "He has certain standards regarding airport motels. He removed them. Mostly." Beatrice turned and left her efficiency a whirlwind of quiet competence. Elara's head was spinning. Cancelled? Dispatched a team? They were moving her life, her carefully constructed escape plan, without even asking her. The anger was immediate, a hot flare of defiance. "You have no right," she said, her voice shaking with a new emotion. Not fear, but fury. "No, Julian Thorne agreed calmly. I do not. I have, however, the ability and the intention to see you safe. You can be angry with me tomorrow. Tonight, you will be secure. He held out a hand, not to take hers, but as an offering. A gesture toward the door. The choice, of course, is still yours. You can take your chances with the motel, or you can accept my protection until you are in a position to no longer need it. She looked at his hand. It was a strong hand, clean and unadorned. It was not grabbing or pulling. It was simply waiting. She thought about the cold, anonymous room she had booked. She thought about the look on Marcus's face, the certainty that he would hunt her down. He would not see it as losing a partner. He would see it as a theft of his property. She thought about the way Julian Thorne had said her name, Miss Hayes. The way he had spoken of her work, exceptional. She was so tired. The quiet exhaustion of long-term suffering was a weight in her bones. For the first time, someone was offering to carry it for a little while. Slowly, she lowered her arms from around her chest. She did not take his hand, but she gave a single sharp nod. It was enough. Very well, he said. He led the way out of the lounge, through a private corridor she hadn't known existed, to a service elevator. The ride down was silent. He did not speak. He simply stood beside her, a bastion of quiet, solid presence. He did not fill the silence with meaningless chatter. He let it be. The car waiting in the subterranean garage was not a flashy limousine. It was a black, armored sedan that was so understated it was ostentatious. A driver held the door open. Julian gestured for her to get in first. As she slid onto the cool leather, she looked back at the Aetherid Tower, her tower rising into the night sky. From down here, it looked immense, powerful, inviolable. She felt very, very small. The drive was long, leaving the dense heart of the city and moving into the wooded, rolling hills of the countryside. They passed through a set of immense wrought iron gates that opened for them without a sound and drove up a long, winding lane, flanked by ancient oaks. The estate was not a house. It was a sprawling collection of stone buildings that seemed to have grown out of the landscape itself. It was old, established, and radiated the kind of deep, quiet structural power that Julian Thorne embodied. The car pulled to a stop in a gravel courtyard. An old woman with a cascade of silver hair, pinned in an elegant knot, stood at the top of the stone steps, a warm shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Despite the mildness of the night, she was watching them with keen, intelligent eyes. Julian stepped out of the car and opened the door for Elara. He turned to the woman. Mother. The woman's eyes were not on her son. They were on Elara, a searching but not unkind gaze. So, this is the architect, she said. Her voice was like aged whiskey, smooth and potent. You were right, Julian. The photograph did not do her justice. She descended the steps and took Elara's hands in her own. Her skin was cool and dry. Welcome, my dear. I am Elara Thorne. We've been expecting you. Elara was led into a grand hall with a soaring ceiling and a fireplace large enough to stand in. A fire was crackling, casting a warm, dancing light on the stone walls. It was the opposite of the cold, glittering penthouse. It was a sanctuary. You must be exhausted, Eleanor said, herding her toward a comfortable-looking armchair. Julian, stop hovering. Beatrice is seeing to her room. Let the girl breathe. Julian retreated to the shadows near the hearth, his presence still palpable but no longer overwhelming. Elara sank into the chair. The leather was soft, worn. It felt like a sigh. I don't know what to say, Elara managed. There is nothing you need to say tonight, Eleanor said kindly. Tonight you rest. Tomorrow you can begin to think, and Julian will begin to act. She gave her son a pointed look. Quietly, I trust. As always, he murmured from the shadows. Later, in a bedroom larger than her entire apartment, Elara stood by the window, looking out over the dark sleeping gardens. The emerald gown lay pooled on the floor where she had let it fall. She was wearing a simple silk robe that had been laid out for her. On the dresser, her few personal effects from her purse were arranged neatly. Her keys, her wallet, a worn copy of a book on bridge engineering, and beside them, a single, perfect gardenia in a crystal vase. Her belongings from the storage unit had not yet arrived. The efficient Beatrice had sent a message that the team was being thorough, cataloging every item. Blueprints, textbooks, drafting tools, a few sentimental objects, the sum total of a life she had kept hidden. Now it was all being brought here, into the heart of this fortress. She felt a familiar surge of panic, the instinct to run to maintain control by staying invisible. But the panic was different this time. It was a disorienting relief. Someone else was handling the logistics of her survival. She was angry at the presumption, at the high-handed way Julian Thorne had taken over. But under the anger was a current of profound, bone-deep gratitude. He had not offered help. He had provided it. She thought about his words. "I make it my business to know." He hadn't just seen her work. He had understood it. He had recognized her signature, not just as a name, but as a mark of authorship. For 4 years, Marcus had called her a draftsman. In one evening, Julian Thorne had called her an architect. The word, in his quiet voice, had felt like a coronation. She slept that night without dreaming, a deep, heavy, dreamless sleep. It was the kind of sleep that comes after a long fever has broken. The next morning she woke to the sound of birdsong. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows. Her belongings had arrived. Not dumped in a pile, but arranged with startling care. Her books were on the shelves, her clothes were in the closet. On a large drafting table that had been set up near the window, her professional tools were laid out ready for use. And beside them, a neat stack of her original blueprints for the Aethelred Tower. There was a knock on the door. It was Beatrice holding a tablet. "Good morning, Miss Hayes. Mr. Thorne asked me to inform you that his legal team has already filed a restraining order against Mr. Vance on your behalf. It was granted by a judge an hour ago." Elara stared at her. "On what grounds?" "Multiple. Witness statements from the gala. For one, your own testimony will be required, when you are ready. But, primarily," Beatrice tapped her screen, "on the basis of a motion to dissolve your professional partnership and a concurrent filing for intellectual property theft against him." Elara felt the floor shift beneath her feet. "He's suing Marcus?" "Mr. Thorne does not sue," Beatrice corrected gently. "He acquires, he absorbs, he dismantles. The legal filings are merely the public-facing paperwork that accompanies the process." She smiled, a rare, thin smile. "He feels Mr. Vance has mismanaged an asset in which he has a significant investment, namely, your work." The scale of what was happening began to dawn on her. This was not just about protecting her from an abusive ex-partner. This was a corporate takeover executed with the precision of a military campaign. Julian Thorne was not just offering her a safe house. He was systematically demolishing Marcus's entire world. Over the next few days, the Thorne estate became her world. It was a quiet, orderly universe that revolved around its silent, watchful son. Julian was often gone during the day, but his presence was felt in the seamless functioning of the household. Meals appeared. The library was always open to her. She spent hours walking the vast, manicured grounds, the silence and space a balm on her frayed nerves. She spent most of her time with Eleonora. The older woman was a sharp, insightful companion. They talked about art, about history, about gardening. Eleonora never asked about Marcus directly. Instead, she asked about Elara's work. She asked about the challenges of designing a building that tall, about the way the wind would affect the upper floors, about the choice of materials. She listened with genuine, intelligent interest. Julian was always fascinated by how things were built. Eleonora said one afternoon as they sat in the rose garden, "Not the finished product, but the bones, the structure." He would take his toys apart just to see how they fit together. It used to drive his father mad. She looked at Elara over the rim of her teacup. "He sees the same thing in you, the mind that builds. It's why he was so insistent." Elara felt a warmth spread through her chest. It was validation, pure and simple, recognition from a woman whose quiet strength mirrored her son's. Her interactions with Julian were brief, formal, yet charged with an unspoken understanding. They would sometimes pass in a hallway exchanging a quiet nod. One evening, she found him in the library, a massive two-story room lined with books from floor to ceiling. He was standing at a large table, looking at a set of ancient architectural drawings. "A 16th century design for a Florentine cathedral," he said without turning around, as if he had known she was there all along. "It was never built. The engineering was too ambitious for the time." She walked to his side, looking at the delicate ink lines. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "But he's put too much load on the central pillars. It would have collapsed before the dome was finished." Julian finally turned his head to look at her. A flicker of something, surprise, respect, passed through his cool gray eyes. "That's what my engineer said. It took them 2 days to figure it out. It's my job to see the flaw in the design," she said simply. "Yes," he said, his voice a low murmur. "It is. A slow burn, that's what it was. A relationship developing not through grand gestures or passionate declarations, but through these quiet moments of mutual recognition." He saw her competence. She was beginning to see the man behind the fearsome corporate titan. A man who respected structure, who valued intelligence, who moved through the world with a quiet, deliberate purpose that she found herself beginning to trust. She asserted her independence in small ways. She insisted on helping the head gardener prune the roses. She began sketching new ideas on the drafting table in her room, a community library, a pedestrian bridge. She was not a guest waiting for rescue. She was an architect in a period of transition. One evening, Beatrice brought her a stack of legal documents. "Mr. Thorne thought you would want to see these. It's the initial discovery from Mr. Vance's company. Accounts." Elara spent hours poring over them. It was worse than she thought. Marcus hadn't just been taking credit for her work. He had been embezzling funds, cutting corners on safety protocols for his other projects, falsifying reports to investors. The Aethelred Tower, her perfect, beautiful building, was the sole legitimate success propping up a rotten empire. The realization was sickening but also clarifying. Her decision to leave hadn't just been about self-preservation. It had been a moral imperative. Meanwhile, Marcus was proving Julian's assessment of him correct. From news reports she read online, he was in a state of complete delusion. He gave an interview to a financial journal, dismissing the rumors of a Thorne Industries takeover as aggressive posturing from a jealous competitor. He told the reporter, "My firm is stronger than ever, and my partner, Elara, will be back at my side shortly. She's just taking a small, well-deserved vacation." He filed a frivolous lawsuit, just as Julian had predicted. He claimed Elara had stolen proprietary designs and was conspiring with Thorne Industries to undermine his business. The arrogance was breathtaking. He was a man who believed his own press releases. He had no idea that the ground beneath his feet had already been sold. One afternoon, Julian found her on the terrace, staring at the tablet, displaying the news of Marcus's lawsuit. Her face was tight with anger. "He's lying," she said, her voice shaking. "He's trying to destroy my reputation." Julian stood beside her, looking out at the horizon. "He is working from an outdated file. He has a version of you in his head that is weak, dependent, and easily intimidated. He has not updated it to reflect the reality that you are none of those things." He paused. "His actions are predictable, and therefore manageable." "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "For now, I'm going to let him continue. He believes he is in a war of public opinion. He does not understand that the war is already over. The paperwork was signed 3 days ago. He is simply the last one to know." The final act, Julian explained, would take place at a private dinner he was hosting at the estate in a week's time. It was an annual event for the board members of his core holding company and a few of the city's most influential figures. It was the heart of his power structure. "He will try to get in," Julian said, his voice calm and certain. "He will see it as his last chance to confront me, to appeal to my partners, to make a public scene and force you back to his side. He will believe it is his stage." "And you're going to let him?" Elara asked, horrified. I'm going to provide him with the opportunity to display the full scope of his character to an audience that matters, Julian corrected. His ruin must be absolute, not just financial, but social. It must be a story told in the rooms where power is brokered so that it is never questioned. He looked at her. And you will be there, not as a victim, but as a witness to the final balancing of the books. The night of the dinner, the estate was transformed. Candles flickered in every window. The air hummed with quiet, powerful conversations. The men and women gathered in the grand hall were the architects of the city's commerce and culture. They were not the flashy, performative crowd from the gala. They were the real thing. Elara wore a simple, elegant black dress. It was her own, her choice. When she walked down the grand staircase, a hush fell over the room. Julian was waiting at the bottom. He was wearing a dark blue suit that made him look like a king in his court. He didn't offer his arm. Instead, he simply stood by her side as they turned to face the room together. A partnership. He began to make introductions. He did not introduce her as his guest. He introduced her by name. Elara Hayes. Meet Jonathan Croft, of the City Planning Commission. He was a great admirer of your solution for the wind shear problem on the Aethelred's upper floors. One by one, he introduced her to people who knew her work, who saw her not as an accessory, but as a peer. The feeling was intoxicating. It was the kind of validation she had craved for years, delivered not with fanfare, but with quiet, factual respect. The trap was sprung just as dinner was being served. A commotion at the main door, a raised voice. Marcus. He had somehow gotten past the outer security, likely with a forged invitation and a lot of bluster. He burst into the dining hall, his face flushed, his eyes wild. He was dressed impeccably, but he wore his desperation like a cheap cologne. He scanned the room, his gaze landing on Elara. She was seated at the main table, next to Julian. The sight seemed to break something in him. The last vestiges of his control shattered. "Elara!" he shouted, stalking toward the table. The quiet conversations died. Every eye in the room turned to him. "What is this? What are you doing with him?" "You have an obligation to me." He reached her chair, his hand clamping down on her arm, a sickening echo of that night at the gala. "We're leaving now. You have a lawsuit to answer for. You owe me everything." Elara did not flinch. She looked at his hand on her arm, then up at his face, her expression cold and clear. "Let go of my arm, Marcus." Julian Thorne rose slowly from his chair. He did not raise his voice. He did not move quickly. He simply unfolded to his full height, a figure of absolute chilling calm. "Marcus," he said, his voice a low, conversational tone that carried to every corner of the silent room. "I believe we have some business to conclude." Marcus turned to him, sneering. "Stay out of this, Thorne. This is between me and my partner." "She is not your partner," Julian said. "And you and I have no business, because as of 9:34 this morning, your business is my business." He picked up a slim tablet from the table. He tapped the screen. "Vance Development, the company you built on a foundation of lies and Elara Hayes' talent, was acquired in a hostile takeover by a subsidiary of Thorne Industries. The motion was approved by your board of directors, most of whom I also own, yesterday afternoon. The final paperwork was filed with the SEC this morning. You are no longer CEO. You are no longer on the board. You are, as of this moment, unemployed." Marcus's face went slack, the color draining from it. "You're bluffing." "I do not bluff," Julian said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming even more precise. "The lawsuit you filed against Miss Hayes for intellectual property theft? My legal team has filed a countersuit on her behalf. We have sworn affidavits from 3 of your former engineers and a complete forensic analysis of your servers. It proves conclusively that you systematically erased her name and credentials from all public-facing documents while using her private, copyrighted work to secure funding." He paused. "The district attorney's office received a copy of that file this afternoon. They found it compelling, especially the parts about the safety violations at your Bellwether Plaza project. It seems you used substandard steel to increase your profit margin. The potential for criminal charges is, I'm told, significant." Julian swiped to another screen on the tablet. Your penthouse apartment? The mortgage was held by a bank I acquired last month. You are in default. Eviction proceedings will begin Monday. He swiped again. Your portfolio of stocks? Your credit lines? Frozen, pending the outcome of the fraud investigation. He laid out the destruction of Marcus's life, piece by piece, with the dispassionate air of an auditor reading a report. It was not a show of anger. It was a final, brutal accounting. Marcus stared at him, his mouth opening and closing silently. The swagger, the arrogance, the entire carefully constructed edifice of his life had been demolished in 90 seconds of quiet conversation. He was nothing, a ghost. He dropped to his knees. It was not a dramatic theatrical gesture. It was a complete collapse of the physical self. His legs simply gave out. He knelt there, on the priceless Persian rug, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a costume on a broken mannequin. "Please," he whispered, the word a ragged, pathetic sound. He was looking at Julian, his eyes swimming with terror and disbelief. "Please, don't." Julian Thorne looked down at the kneeling man, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he looked at Elara. She was still seated, her face pale but composed. She met his gaze in her eyes. He saw not triumph, not pity, but a cold, cathartic clarity. The end of a long, dark chapter. Julian gave a nearly imperceptible nod to the two men, who had once again materialized at the edge of the room. They moved forward, lifted the sobbing, incoherent Marcus to his feet, and escorted him from the hall. He did not resist. He was a hollow man, dragged away from the ruins of his own making. The silence in the room was absolute. Every powerful person in that hall had just witnessed a complete and total annihilation, executed not with a sword, but with a tablet and a quiet voice. Julian Thorne sat back down. He picked up his wineglass. He looked at the assembled guests, his gaze calm and steady. Then he turned to the woman beside him, placing a hand gently on her back. "Allow me to reintroduce you all," he said, his voice resonating in the stillness. "This is Elara Hayes. She is not a consultant. She is not a junior partner. She is the chief architect and visionary behind the Aethrid Tower. She has been the most capable person in every room she has been in for the past 4 years, and no one bothered to ask her name." He raised his glass. "Going forward, she will be the head of the new independent architectural division at Thorne Industries, where her name will be on every door and every document." To Elara Hayes, a room full of the most powerful people in the city rose to their feet and raised their glasses, not to him, but to her. It was a chorus of recognition, a wave of validation that washed over her, clean and bright. She felt a smile touch her lips. A real smile, one that reached her eyes for the first time in years. Later that night, long after the last guest had departed, Elara stood with Julian on a wide stone balcony, overlooking the sleeping estate, and the air was cool and smelled of damp earth and night-blooming jasmine. The silence between them was no longer structural. It was comfortable. It was home. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice a low murmur beside her. "I am," she said, and was surprised to find it was the absolute truth. The weight she had carried for so long, the quiet exhaustion of being unseen and unvalued, was gone. It had not just been lifted, it had been vaporized. In its place was a profound sense of peace, a feeling of being correctly placed in the world. "Thank you, Julian." He turned to her, his face illuminated by the soft light from the house. "I did what was necessary to protect my investment." She looked at him, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. The building, or the architect, for the first time since she had met him, a genuine smile touched Julian Thorne's mouth. It transformed his severe, handsome face, making him look younger, less formidable. "The architect. Of course, the building is merely steel and glass. It has no soul." He looked at her. "You were the soul of it all along." He reached out and took her hand. His touch was warm, firm, and steady. It was not a gesture of possession or passion. It was a gesture of partnership. A quiet acknowledgement of an alliance forged in crisis and solidified in mutual respect. "He truly never knew you," Julian said, looking out at the dark line of the trees. "He saw you as a beautiful object he could own. He never understood that your beauty was the least interesting thing about you." Elara leaned her head against his shoulder. It felt right, solid, safe. "And what do you see?" He was quiet for a long moment, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "I see a woman who endured the unendurable with grace. I see a mind that can bend steel and light into something extraordinary. I see my partner." The word hung in the air between them, filled with promise. Not the hollow promise of romance, but the solid, foundational promise of a shared future. "So what comes next?" she whispered. He turned his head, his lips brushing against her hair. "Now," he said, his voice full of a quiet, certain joy, "we have a lot to build." She looked out at the dark, sprawling landscape, at the endless possibility of the horizon. The fear was gone. The exhaustion was gone. She felt a slow, deep exhale leave her body, releasing the last ghosts of her past. She was not the woman they never introduced anymore. She was the woman whose name was the foundation of everything that was to come. "I know," she said, her voice steady and clear, full of a strength she was only just beginning to recognize as her own. "Let's get to work."